Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech for you. This is deck number 152 and it's titled How Many Fogs Could a Fog Frog Fog If a Fog Frog Could Fog Frogs? And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from cards suggested by the audience, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, as you may be able to guess, we have something to do with frogs because our random card was suggested to us by Sean over on Discord, and that card is Spore Frog. Now, Sean knew exactly what he was doing suggesting this card because if you don't know, Spore Frog is my least favorite card in the entire game of Magic the Gathering. I would be willing to bet I've lost more games to this little frog than any other card out there. So, not my favorite card to put into a deck, definitely not my favorite card to see across the table, but that doesn't matter when we're working with a random card. So we are building around Spore Frog this week, and in case you don't know what it does, it is 1 green mana for a 1/1 frog. Sacrifice Spore Frog, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Since I typically like to play decks that want to turn their creatures sideways and keep attacking, having an on-board fog effect is not exactly where we want to be with a lot of the decks that I play, which is why it's up there in my least favorite cards. Now, with that being said, we could very easily turn this into a fog deck and just prevent a bunch of combat damage, but that didn't really feel like something I wanted to do. As weird as it was, the fact that I dislike this card made me lean away from why it's actually so good, and instead, for the commander of this deck, we're leaning in a opposite direction. Instead of preventing damage, we want to be causing the damage. So our commander this week is Grolnok the Omnivore, which is 2 green-blue for a 3/3 legendary creature frog. Whenever a frog you control attacks, mill 3 cards. Whenever a permanent card is put into your graveyard from your library, exile it with a croak counter on it, and you may play lands and cast spells from among cards you own in exile with croak counters on them. So since Spore Frog is a frog, we can put it in Grolnok, and now instead of wanting to prevent combat damage, we are wanting to do it ourselves because we're going to keep attacking with a bunch of frogs, mill a bunch of cards, and then hopefully create enough value to win the game. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of our themes and what we're really trying to do. Obviously, the first theme we've already mentioned, it's frogs, and this is a little bit iffy because it's not just frogs that are creatures. We do also have some other cards in here like the shapeshifters that count as frogs. But we also have every card that I could find in our colors that references frogs in some way. So we have cards that turn our opponent's creatures into frogs. We've got enchantments we can put onto our creatures that give them frogs' abilities. We have frogs that are in the deck that honestly don't do anything, but they're still frogs. So we went really deep into the frog theme for this week and really tried to put as many frogs and frog-related cards in the deck as possible, which of course means we're also running EDH All-Star Chubtoad. And Chubtoad is 2 and a green for a 1/1 summon toad. It is now just a creature toad. Chubtoad gets +2/+2 until the end of turn when blocking or blocked. And of course, whenever you play the Chubtoad, you gotta remember the rhyme on there, right? Chubtoad at the door, run away quick or you'll run no more. Obviously, every child's favorite rhyme. I'm sure we all have it memorized. But other than just frogs, because if we're being perfectly honest, they're not exactly high-powered creatures, we need to have some ways to support them. And one of the best ways we can support our frogs is using cards that care about cards going to the graveyard. Since Grolnok is milling us every time we attack with a frog, we want to use cards like Ghost of Ramirez de Pietro to be able to rebuy all of our frogs and, well, our support frog friends as well. So the Ghost is 2 and a blue for a 2/3 spirit pirate. Ghost of Ramirez de Pietro can't be blocked by creatures with toughness 3 or greater, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, choose up to 1 target card in a graveyard that was discarded or put there from a library this turn, put that card into its owner's hand. Now, it also has partner, but since it's in the 99 of our deck, that's not going to be relevant. What is relevant, though, is that we are milling a bunch of cards with our commander, but we can only exile permanents with croak counters. That means instants and sorceries aren't getting exiled, and we can't play them if they go to our graveyard. The Ghost allows us to do that. So we can rebuy any of our removal spells, maybe our board wipes, maybe our ramp spells, things that we want to still be casting, but that we might have accidentally milled. So this is a great way to benefit from the mill without necessarily being a frog. But obviously, Ghost of Ramirez de Pietro is a friend to the frogs. He's a spirit pirate. I imagine frogs and pirates get along well, but I suppose I don't know for sure. And then, of course, that leads us to our final theme, which is cards that kind of want to be in the graveyard. A great way to make sure that we can always get value from milling ourselves is to make sure that there's always cards that benefit from being in the graveyard. Dryad's Revival is one of the best. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, and it also has flashback for 4 and a green. Since we're putting a bunch of stuff into our graveyard, there might be times when we go to mill a bunch of cards and someone kills our commander in response, meaning that we just have to mill those cards. We don't get to exile them with croak counters. And Dryad's Revival is a way that we could actually cast from our hand, but we can also cast it from our graveyard in case it gets milled over, always giving us access to it. So there's a bunch of cards in the deck that function very similarly to this. They're cards that either have flashback or care about the number of cards in our graveyard or something like that. So Dryad's Revival, obviously very good, but it's not the only card in here that wants to do what it does in the graveyard. However, those are our themes for this week, and the next thing we got to do is take a look at some key cards. These are cards that might be win conditions or might just be value pieces, but either way, they're some of the most important cards in our deck. Now, the first one we're going to talk about, there's a couple of cards that do something very similar, but I wanted to highlight this one in particular just because I like it, and it's one that is probably most recognizable, and that is Laboratory Maniac. Since we are milling ourselves so much, 3 cards every single time we attack with a frog really adds up very, very quickly. There is a chance we mill out our entire deck, and we need to make sure that if that's the case, we have ways to continue the game. So Laboratory Maniac is going to just win us the game if that's the case, because it is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. We have a couple of effects like this. We have Jace the Planeswalker that does the same thing. We have Ormos that instead of winning the game just gets +1/+1 counters. We do not have Thassa's Oracle simply because it's a little bit too strong for what we're trying to do, and it's also a little bit too difficult to interact with, and I didn't think the frogs wanted something that was that difficult to deal with. So we decided not to include it, but we have ways to win the game from milling ourselves. And one of the nice things about Laboratory Maniac being a creature is that if we mill it over with all of our Grolnok triggers, we can actually just recast it from exile because it's going to get a croak counter on it, so we can just keep doing what we're doing and not have to worry about potentially milling over the win condition. Now, moving on to our second key card, this one is going to be Shigeki Jukai Visionary. And I know it's a little bit controversial. The 2 key cards we've talked about are not frogs, which feels very off-brand, but Shigeki is a big friend to the frogs, and snakes are kind of like frogs with no legs, I guess, in a way. But anyway, Shigeki is 1 and a green for a 1/3 legendary enchantment creature, Snake Druid. 1 and a green, tap, return Shigeki to its owner's hand, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and put the rest into your graveyard. That's great because we're putting stuff from the top of our deck into our graveyard, but also we can channel Shigeki for XX green, discard Shigeki, return X target non-legendary cards from your graveyard to your hand. Again, a way to rebuy spells that are put into our graveyard is incredibly important, especially if Grolnok is removed in response to the milling. So Shigeki being able to get us lands and then go back to our hand and then discard to get other cards out of our graveyard means that it can kind of accrue some of its own value throughout the course of the game, and is a great way to generate value early while also still generating value late game, which is exactly what we want to be doing. With that being said, though, let's move into our final key card, and this one is actually a frog. I figured we gotta have at least one frog on the key cards list, otherwise, what's the point in calling ourselves a frog deck? So our frog that we're going to talk about is Omnivore, which is 1 green, green, blue for a 3/3 frog, and it's a pretty simple ability that is very flavorful in this deck. Tap, target creature becomes a frog with base power and toughness 3/3 until the end of turn. Obviously, frogs are so great we want to share them with our opponents, and if our opponents aren't playing frogs, well, they should be. So we're going to turn their stuff into frogs, and they're still pretty big. They're 3/3s. They're still going to be doing what they want to be doing. And unfortunately for our opponents, it's only until the end of turn. They don't get to keep the frog permanently, which I know is a huge disappointment. So Omnivore really puts in work as a bit of a removal if something has an ability we don't want them to have, or our opponents are going to try to hit us with a giant creature. We can turn them into a frog, maybe shrink it down, take away its abilities, and then we don't really have to worry about too much. So Omnivore, very good, very powerful, but overall, those are our key cards. And the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck, things that synergize very well together and sometimes create value engines on their own, sometimes they lead to a win. But most of the time, they're just cards that, honestly, I like talking about because they're kind of unique and work together in fun ways. So the first cool interaction we're going to be talking about is between Troll-bred Guardian and Plaxcaster Frogling. This is where we get all of our frogs. So Troll-bred Guardian is 4 and a green for a 5/5 Troll Frog Warrior. It has Adapt 2 for 2 and a green, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample. This is super big because there's a weird number of frogs that care about counters. The best one, though, is Plaxcaster Frogling, which is 1 green, blue for a 0/0 frog mutant. It has Graft 3, and you can pay 2, and target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains Shroud until the end of turn. So this is a great way to protect some of our creatures if we need to, but more importantly, because it has Graft 3, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, we can move a counter from the Frogling onto the creature that just entered, and then because Troll-bred Guardian gives everything with a counter on it Trample, we now give the new creature that just entered Trample. So if we have a giant frog that comes in, we put a counter on it, make it even bigger, give it Trample, and we can pay 2 to give it Shroud and protect it, really works with what we're trying to do, considering most of our game plan is about attacking, and unfortunately, a lot of frogs start off pretty small, so we need to find ways to boost up their power and make sure that we can get in there and hopefully deal enough damage that the milling can get us there eventually, or if it can't, then we can knock out our opponents through combat as well. But that is only cool interaction number 1. We've still got number 2 to talk about, and this one is going to be between Species Gorger and Haze Frog. So yes, I know I mentioned I don't like Spore Frog. I'm less low on Haze Frog, despite the fact that it does something very similar, and I'll kind of explain why in just a second. But let's start off with Species Gorger so we can get the frog beast out of the way. It is 3 green, blue for a 6/6 frog beast. At the beginning of your upkeep, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. Normally, that would be a downside, but if we're playing a card that has an enter the battlefield effect, we can turn it into an upside, which is exactly why Haze Frog fills this spot. Haze Frog is 3 green, green for a 2/1 frog. It's got Flash. When Haze Frog enters the battlefield, prevent all combat damage that other creatures would deal this turn. Now, like I said, I'm not a fan of Spore Frog, mainly because it's 1 mana. Personally, I think Haze Frog at 5 is perfectly fine. If you want to hold up 5 mana to stop me from attacking, that makes sense. But the reason this is a cool interaction for our deck is because we can flash in Haze Frog on someone's turn, prevent them from dealing damage to us, maybe kill a creature because Haze Frog can still deal damage. It's the only creature that still can. And then, in our upkeep, Species Gorger can return Haze Frog to our hand, letting us do it again when that player attacks us next turn. Now, obviously, we can't do it on every single player's turn, but being able to shut down one player's combat step is incredibly powerful, and it's a great way to make sure that we can keep attacking and then just keep milling cards and keep advancing our game plan while we kind of shut down maybe the aggressive strategy at the table. So that is why Species Gorger and Haze Frog are in here, not necessarily just because they're frogs, but obviously being frogs doesn't hurt their chances of making the cut in the deck. So those are all of our cool interactions, and the next thing we've got to do for our deck tech is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the price is actually pretty low considering our budget is $100 because it's only coming in at $41.42. And I mentioned earlier that we didn't include Thassa's Oracle for power reasons. Budget was another reason. Because I wanted to try to keep the deck as cheap as possible, I didn't want to include anything that was super expensive. And in fact, the most expensive card in the deck is only about $3.37, and that's Nissa Vastwood Seer, which of course has Nissa Sage Animist on the back of it. Nissa, once again, not a frog, but is a big friend to the frogs because she allows us to ramp. We can search our library for a forest, put it into our hand, and then she flips when we have 7 or more lands, which ideally we will have. And then we're able to continue to ramp with Nissa's plus ability, we're able to make a 4/4 with her -2 ability, and then of course we can untap up to 6 target lands, they become 6/6 creatures with her -7 ability. Doing all of this doesn't necessarily play well with our milling strategy and our frog strategy. She's really in here just as a ramp piece, and I wanted to try to include as many permanents that ramped as possible. The goal was to stay away from things like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach and Rampant Growth, and that's not to say that there aren't still cards like that in the deck, but being able to ramp on a permanent means that if we mill it, we're not out of luck. We can still get it back with Grolnok, and therefore kind of keep advancing the game plan. So that's why Nissa's here. Obviously, if you do need to cut it, there are 3 mana or even cheaper, like 2 mana ramp pieces that don't cost as much as she does, but I do think she's worth it just for being a permanent spell in the deck. Now, with that being said, I do also have a suggestion for a card that you can put into the deck that's a little out of budget. Now, this week when I say out of budget, since our deck is $40, I'm not going to be suggesting an actual out of budget deck because that would be a card that is $60+, and I have no interest in suggesting just the staple cards that are over $60. So instead, if you want to increase the power of the deck for just a little bit of extra cost, I would recommend throwing in the Palantir of Orthanc and taking out Narcomoeba. So the Palantir is 3 mana for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir of Orthanc and scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. So the Palantir is basically going to be drawing us an extra card every single turn, plus letting us scry 2, which is almost always going to be what it does. It's going to be very rare that our opponents are going to want us to mill. Now, sometimes they might, just because they might not fully understand what our deck is trying to do, and that's okay. But most of the time, we have to assume that it's simply just at the beginning of our end step, scry 2, draw a card, which is very good considering that's what we want to be doing. But sometimes there might just be the off chance that someone lets us mill. And if someone does let us mill, we are running away with the game because there's a very good chance that it's got 2, 3, 4, 5 counters on it, and milling that many cards can really be a detriment to what our opponents want to have us do, because that's just exactly what we're aiming to do. Now, with that being said, we move into a bit of a strange replacement here. So the card that I would take out for the Palantir is Narcomoeba, and this looks a little strange because it's a 1 blue for a 1/1 illusion. It's got flying. When it's put into your graveyard from the library, you may put it onto the battlefield. This is really what we want to be doing. We want to mill things and then have things care about going into the graveyard. But there's a little bit of a difficulty with Narcomoeba. Narcomoeba is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer, which is not particularly great. It's also an illusion, so it's not even on brand for what the deck wants to be doing. I mean, look at it. It's a jellyfish that wishes it could be a frog, so like I get it. But Narcomoeba isn't going to work super well with Grolnok either, because the trigger is going to go on the stack, and then the Grolnok trigger is going to resolve first, actually exiling the Narcomoeba. So we would have to mill it in other ways, like with the Palantir, which is possible. We do have other ways to mill in the deck, but our main strategy for milling is Grolnok, and if that doesn't work with Narcomoeba, then it's not going to be nearly as powerful as we want it to be. So with that being said, if you do have a choice between the two, or maybe you just have an extra Palantir or you don't mind the budget restriction, then I would recommend the Palantir over the Narcomoeba. If you do need to keep Narcomoeba in, though, it is still a fine card. It's still going to be able to do what it wants to do a good chunk of the time. Now, with all of that out of the way, and before we get into the actual game, because we got to see how this deck performs in a game, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. Now, obviously, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That is very much appreciated, and we are super, super close to 1,000 subscribers. If you could help us get there, that would be amazing. I'd love to get there by the end of the month, but we'll see. And then if you would like to go a little bit above and beyond to support the channel, you can also find us over on Twitter, find us on Reddit, send me an email. And you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. If you do either of those things, you get to join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, and Richard. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And if you join all of the amazing people, you'll get access to things like the deck lists a week early, which is super useful for me because a lot of my patrons have caught mistakes that I've made, so I can fix them before the videos go up. We've also got access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks and also play the games. So if you've ever wanted to be in the games on the channel, that is one of the best ways to do it. And of course, you also get access to things like the unedited gameplay videos. You could get a random card sent to you every month. It is one of the cards that we build around for the channel. And you can also get the guarantee from me that any of the cards you suggest for future videos for this channel will be turned into videos eventually. I can't promise to get to them super soon. I try to get to them, but obviously I got to work pretty far in advance, and if there's a lot of suggestions, it might take a while. If you don't want to subscribe to the Patreon or as a channel member, you are always still welcome to suggest cards. I will do my best to get to as many of them as I can, but I can't promise to get to them in the same way I can for our channel members and our patrons. So with all of that being said, let's keep moving on. Let's get into the game and see how our deck actually functions. So the game this week is with the same opponents we had last week, and that is because this was actually filmed in the same stream as last week's game. So once again, a game that I've already played in, which is not super common, but we are playing against Tyler, who is running God Eternal Oketra, Barbas, who is running Dina Soulsteeper, and Chris from One More Game playing Kyler Sigardian Emissary. So like I said, this did happen over on Chris's Twitch, so if you are interested, I will make sure to link his videos and his channel in the description below, so do go check him out. Awesome guy. But to run through each of our opponents, Tyler's God Eternal Oketra deck is kind of exactly what it looks like. He wants to play a ton of creatures, then make a ton of zombies, and just keep bouncing his stuff so he can fill up the board with zombies and eventually run over his opponents. I've played against several Oketra decks in the past, and they tend to always get a little out of hand, so I am a little concerned going into this deck. But not as concerned as I am about Barbas's Dina Soulsteeper deck. Now, Dina is one of the decks that I've done on this channel before. It was heavily based off of my wife's personal Dina deck, which is also an absolute menace to sit down and play with. I have gotten run over by it so many times that I know to look out when Dina sits down, so I am very concerned about Barbas' deck. Dina is an incredibly powerful life gain strategy, so having to sit down and know that there are plenty of infinite combos in the deck, know that there's plenty of ways that it can get around some of the combat that we are trying to do, Dina was definitely at the top of my priorities for opponents here. Then, finally, last but not least, we have Chris playing Kyler. This is the same deck that he played last week on the channel as well, because it was in the same recording, like I mentioned. This is a human-style deck. He wants to make as many humans as possible, which is then going to put counters on Kyler and then make his other humans even bigger. So he really wants to go wide while at the same time going tall. And humans is an incredibly powerful creature type because they can kind of do everything, and there's always more and more humans, so this is always a deck to watch out for as well. But with all of that being said, let me know down in the comments which of these decks you think might be the most difficult for our deck to face. Get your predictions in now for what's going to happen, and I will talk to you all once the game is done. At the start of the game, Tyler goes first, followed by myself, Barbas, and then Chris. On Tyler's first turn, he plays a Plains and casts Giver of Runes, which can tap to give another target creature protection from the color of his choice until the end of turn. I play a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1. Barbas plays a Swamp and casts Soul Ring. Chris plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Tyler plays a Plains and casts Mind Stone, then moves to combat and attacks Barbas for 1 with the Giver of Runes. On my turn, I play an Island. Barbas plays a Bayou, then casts Sylvan Library, drawing an additional 2 cards in his upkeep, then having the choice to put up to 2 of the cards drawn back on top of his library, or pay 4 life per card to keep them in his hand. After that, he casts Deathrite Shaman, which can be activated to exile a card from a graveyard, then make a mana if it was a land, make each opponent lose 2 life if it's an instant or sorcery, or gain 2 life if it's a creature. Chris plays an Unclaimed Territory, naming humans, and casts Chaplain of Alms, and also casts Fragmentize, destroying Barbas' Sylvan Library. On Tyler's turn, he plays a Kabira Plateau. I play a Forest and cast Fertile Footsteps, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play, and sending the Beanstalk Giant on an adventure. Barbas casts Birds of Paradise, and then plays a Bloodstained Mire, and passes. Chris casts a Cryptolith Rite, letting all his creatures tap for a mana of any color, then plays a Canopy Vista. Tyler casts his own Soul Ring, then casts his commander God Eternal Oketra, letting him make a 4/4 zombie token with Vigilance whenever he casts a creature. On my turn, I cast Chub Toad, followed up by casting Spore Frog. Then, at the end of turn, Barbas sacrifices his Bloodstained Mire, losing a life, and searching his library for an Overgrown Tomb, putting it into play untapped, paying 2 life, and this lets him activate Deathrite Shaman, exiling Fragmentize from Chris's graveyard, and making each of his opponents lose 2 life. Then on Barbas' turn, he plays a Forest and casts Bolas's Citadel, letting him cast spells and play lands from the top of his library, spending life instead of mana to do so. On Chris's turn, he casts Return to Nature, destroying Barbas' Bolas's Citadel. Tyler cast an Oreskos Explorer, making a zombie token and searching his library for 2 plains since 2 opponents control more lands than he does, putting them into his hand. He then plays one of the plains that he just searched for and cast Ornithopter, making another zombie token. He also cast Master of Ceremonies, making another zombie, then moves to combat, attacking Barbas for 6 with his commander Oketra. On my turn, I cast my commander, Grolnok the Omnivore, letting me mill 3 when a frog I control attacks, exile all permanents put into my graveyard from my library, and exile them with croak counters. Then I'm able to cast spells and play lands that are exiled with croak counters. I move to combat, attacking Chris and Barbas both for 1, milling 6 cards, and exiling Bloated Toad, Path of Ancestry, Island, and Command Tower from my graveyard with croak counters on them. Then in my second main phase, I play a Path of Ancestry from exile, and at the end of turn, Barbas activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Dryad's Revival from my graveyard and making each opponent lose 2 life. On his turn, he plays a Twilight Mire and casts Grist the Hunger Tide. He then casts his commander, Dina Soulsteeper, making each opponent lose a life whenever he gains a life. However, he activates Grist's -2 ability, sacrificing Dina to destroy God Eternal Oketra. In response though, Tyler activates Giver of Runes, giving Oketra protection from black until the end of turn, saving her. On Chris's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Adeline Resplendent Cathar, letting him make a tapped and attacking 1/1 human token for each opponent whenever he attacks, which he immediately does, attacking me for 1 with the Chaplain and making a 1/1 human attacking each opponent. Then we all block the token, killing it, while I take 1 from the Chaplain. In Tyler's upkeep, Master of Ceremonies triggers, making each player choose to draw a card, make a treasure, or make a 1/1 citizen token. Then Tyler gets to also do whatever each opponent chooses. This ends with Barbas and I choosing to draw a card, while Chris makes a treasure, so Tyler draws 2 and makes a treasure. He then plays an Idyllic Grange, putting a +1/+1 counter on Oketra when it enters, and moves to combat, attacking Chris for 8 with Oketra, and me for 12 with his 3 zombie warriors. On my turn, I play a Command Tower from exile, then attack Barbas and Chris both for 1, milling myself for 6, and exiling a Forest, Island, Temple of the False God, Trollbred Guardian, Borog Befuddler, and Primeval Herald with croak counters on them. In my second main phase, I cast a Plax Caster Frogling, which has Graft 3, and I also cast Anurid Swarm Snapper, grafting a +1/+1 counter from the Frogling onto it. Then, at the end of turn, Barbas activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling Return to Nature from Chris's graveyard, making each of his opponents lose 2 life. On Barbas' turn, he activates Grist's +1 ability, milling the top card of his library and making a 1/1 insect token. He then casts Witherbloom Apprentice, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever he casts or copies a spell. Once that resolves, he casts Chain of Smog, making target player discard a card, then the targeted player may copy Chain of Smog and choose new targets for it. By targeting himself, Barbas is able to copy Chain of Smog an infinite number of times, discarding his hand, but, more importantly, making each opponent lose an infinite amount of life while he gains an infinite amount of life, winning Barbas the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a little bit on the faster side. The game only lasted about 6 turns, but like I mentioned before, Dina is super, super powerful. So I was not surprised when Barbas was able to pull out an infinite combo kind of out of nowhere. And it was made even more impressive by the fact that he didn't tutor at any point during the game. He mentioned that he actually drew his second combo piece off the Master of Ceremonies, which is kind of fun. So very, very cool win by Barbas, and I feel like this only further supports my theory that Dina is always enemy number 1 at the table. So very, very cool win. Moving around the table though, everyone kind of did something with their deck. Chris unfortunately kind of ran out of lands to play, but he played a very important role by shutting down Barbas early on, being able to get rid of the Sylvan Library and the Bolas' Citadel. Made a huge impact on the game, and I'm sure that Barbas would have been able to win a lot sooner had Chris not done that. So a very big thank you to Chris for slowing down the game a little bit, giving our frogs a little time to shine. Next up, though, Tyler, his God Eternal Oketra deck, did, well, exactly what a God Eternal Oketra deck is supposed to do. He played a bunch of creatures, made a bunch of zombies, and he really looked like the threat. At the point when the game ended, we were all kind of focused on Tyler and what he was doing, and none of us expected Barbas to kind of come out of nowhere with the win. So I think it really let him fly under the radar a little bit, which is kind of unfortunate for the table, but very fortunate for him. But overall, Tyler's deck was very, very cool. Once again, I really haven't seen a God Eternal Oketra deck that I've disliked. I think it's a very neat strategy, and it plays a lot of cards that are very unique to that deck, which is always a ton of fun. And then finally, our frogs, we didn't get the chance to do quite as much as I was hoping, but we were still able to get Grolnok down and mill ourselves at least twice. We milled a total of 12 cards just from 2 attack steps, which is pretty powerful. And honestly, if we'd had more frogs, which we were starting to get, I think that we could have milled a good portion of our deck and really had access to pretty much anything we wanted at any given time, which is a ton of fun and very, very cool. So the deck was a lot of fun to play, and I would highly recommend it if you're into unique creature types or maybe attacking on a different axis. I will be honest, I'm not a big Simic person, and I'm certainly not a big Spore Frog person, but this deck kind of caught me by surprise with how entertaining it was to play. So thank you all so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what cards you think should go in the deck, or maybe cards you think we should cut out of the deck. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future videos, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.